Hey, everybody. Welcome to Visits with Victor. I am Victor Reyes, candidate for Congress. I am joined today by Anamaria Dahl. We will get started here in just a second and talk about how we can make sure that we are preventing gun violence in our communities and the role that the federal government and our members of Congress should be in advocating for that role just here in a second. So we will begin shortly. Thanks, everyone, for joining us on this beautiful afternoon. It's been a long week for everybody that's been watching the end of the state legislature. We are really making progress on a lot of the issues that we all care about and having some remarkable action. But I'm going to go ahead and get started with today's Visit with Victor and just go ahead and start. We're talking today about gun violence. You know, something that as a person who grew up in a generation marked by gun violence is something that is very personal to me, something that I see the very real effects of in our communities each and every single day. And what we saw happen in Georgia this past week was something that unfortunately we see far too often. But it is important that we begin today by calling out that occurrence for what it is. A hate crime against the Asian American community, something that is not just an injustice, but a horrific action that we see too often. It's perpetrated by the same white supremacy that led to the murder of individuals in Charleston attending a Black church. It's the same white supremacy that led to the death of far too many innocent lives in El Paso at the Walmart shooting, and it is a white supremacy that took the lives of 8 people in Atlanta, Georgia. And it is important that we call that out for what it is and be clear about our commitment to ending white supremacy and the systemic roots that it has within our policy, within legislation, and something that I am very committed to. And so now that I've had a chance to say that, I want to take a moment to introduce my distinguished guest, Anamaria Dahl, who is the statewide chapter leader for Moms Demand Action, an advocacy group like none other that has been demanding action on the gun violence epidemic that is tearing so many communities, so many families apart. I'm so honored to have her today. Thank you and welcome, Anamaria. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited that you're doing these little visits with folks, and I'm grateful that you decided to talk about gun violence today.
Well, I appreciate that. Anamaria, I saw you post a pretty poignant post, and I appreciate your advocacy on social media, in the legislature, in every sphere that you are a part of. But you posted something that really struck a chord with me. Hate plus guns equals murder, equals death, equals so much. And, I think that there is a long way for us to go in addressing hate crimes in this country and addressing that issue. And I think with this senseless tragedy that we saw just unfold, it's important for us to be clear. And I would love to get your thoughts on what we can do to really root out this hate in our communities, make sure that what happens and happens too often does not become the norm and something that we become desensitized to. What do you think?
I think there are a lot of ways for systemic change to happen in our communities to drive out hate. But I think what's really what's the lethal element here is the gun. Mm-hmm. We need to ensure that guns are kept locked up and are safe and away from those who should not be able to access them. And we need to ensure there's background checks, and we need to ensure that those people who individuals feel have red flags for that sort of violence are stopped and are offered help.
Absolutely. And, I think that specifically one of the things that I think we need to do is we need to be very clear about passing legislation, specifically also addressing hate crimes and making sure that hate crimes that use threaten to use of violence, of weapons, where that is being perpetrated, that's something that we are specifically targeting. Because you're right, the use of a firearm is a really critical element in this discussion. And when we're looking at it, and today, I'm sure you saw that the House passed the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, and one of our own members of Congress, failed to support that. And in the Violence Against Women Act, there are specific protections when we're talking about closing the boyfriend and the stalker loopholes that, that give so many times allow for the perpetration of access of a firearm for individuals that we know pose a serious risk in a domestic violence situation. Do you think, I think passing VAWA, strengthening VAWA, making sure those protections are in place is a critical element. Is VAWA something that is in one of those intersectional policy ideas that you think could help target gun violence?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Ensuring that offenders who are convicted don't have a firearm is really going to save lives. I mean, here in New Mexico, there's 1 in 3 women that are affected by domestic violence in their lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
For us, especially in the state, we really need to pay attention to these issues.
Yeah, that is absolutely true, and we know we see it and we hear the stories of in the pandemic, right? Of what we're dealing with and how our communities are experiencing heightening levels of domestic violence and have throughout the course of the pandemic, and making sure that there are those clear protections, that people feel like they're not being, that there are tools in place to address these types of instances where folks convicted of stalking, folks convicted of domestic violence don't have access to firearms, can have that there's a way to ensure that presence of a firearm that makes people, often that I think it's 1 in 7 women and 1 in 18 men have been stalked by an intimate partner during their lifetime. I think people don't realize how pervasive that issue is when we're talking about the impact that it's having in our communities. And so I think that's something that needs to happen. And I'm really disappointed in Congresswoman Harrell for her vote on the House floor today. I think it shows that, that there is still a lot of work for us to be doing in Congress. Too many people that want to stand in the way of common sense efforts that are going to protect us, that are going to lead to gun violence prevention measures.
I agree.
Yeah. And, you talked about universal background checks, and I was really proud of the work we did here in New Mexico to pass universal background check legislation in the 2019 legislative session. I know that there are still loopholes that exist that we need to make sure that we are tightening and we are closing. Can you talk about what some of those different loopholes that exist and how we can make sure that the package of universal background check legislation that we're looking at the federal level is truly the most comprehensive and effective vehicle for keeping guns out of the hands of those that shouldn't have them?
So I think closing the Charleston loophole is the biggest issue. So what that means is that when an individual goes to purchase a gun, the background check needs to be completed in those 3 days. And should it not be completed, that individual is allowed to take their gun home. It's not ensuring that individuals who should not possess guns aren't possessing guns. So that's the big issue there.
I agree, and I think we need to make sure that we're moving quickly to ensure the Charleston loophole gets closed. I mean, it's one of those instances where we know there is no question, right, that this loophole leads to individuals who could perpetrate these hate crimes in our country. I mean, what happened in Charleston and the murder at the Black church was a horrific, chilling incident that should have woken us all up, and still here we are. We can't wait any longer to close that loophole, to make sure that we are addressing gun violence in our communities, that we're addressing, that we're preventing even one senseless murder that could exist. And, I think we need to look at how that's failed communities and make sure that we're presenting and being very clear about that data in the way that it's really impacting, who should and should not have a weapon. And, you talked a little bit, you mentioned, the extreme risk, but, I think you were alluding to, extreme risk protective order, making sure that we have a vehicle to remove the firearm from an individual who poses a threat to themselves or others. I worked on that legislation in the 2020 legislative session, making sure that passed at the state level, and being very clear that, when it was stalled in the Senate and we were so close on the votes, was very proud to be part of the team that worked to get that across the finish line and make sure that communities had that vehicle, that people were there. There's still much work to be done to strengthen that law and making sure that we are enhancing it. But are there federal protections when it comes to extreme risk protective orders, other mechanisms like that we should be looking at?
I think with the contents of the Violence Against Women Act, I think that really takes care of a lot of these issues that we've seen. It does close dangerous loopholes in existing federal domestic violence related firearm laws. As a survivor of domestic violence, I know I always hear a lot of false information that's spread. I think with violence in general, people believe that if somebody wants to kill someone, they will. My ex-husband strangled me, and he tried really hard.
Wow.
And I, thank God, am here today. And had he had a gun, it would have been over fast. I feel like he was strangling me for forever. We were fighting. I was going out and in. I was able to get a breath and then lost breath. It was a very long time. And we know with automatic weapons, they can kill multiple people within seconds. So I think that's important to look at the prevention. We know gun violence is preventable.
I agree. And I just want to say thank you for sharing that story. I think there's a lot of power in the stories of survivors like yourself. And I just want to thank you for having the courage to share that story. You are helping save lives every single day. You know, there's no question that the presence of a firearm in a domestic violence situation makes it so much more likely that we are going to see the loss of a life in a very real way. And so from the bottom of my heart, thank you for taking that stand in that moment. And you touched on earlier in this conversation, safe storage. And I think we absolutely need to have safe storage legislation at the federal level to make sure that that is a clear requirement. What does that look like? What does the right policy look like when it comes to the storage of firearms?
So, our legislature was so busy this session. So we were hopeful that Senate Bill 224 would make it. And we are going to not give up like moms do. We keep the efforts going forward, because in 2020 unintentional shootings increased by 17% just in Albuquerque.
Wow.
And we know there's similar stories across the country. There's, like I said before, we know gun violence is preventable, and having a firearm locked and out of the reach of children can save and does save lives.
I agree. And you have my commitment at the federal level that I'm going to champion legislation to make sure that safe storage is a practice in every single community in our country. That is, I've heard stories from family members of children who have access to firearm that they weren't looking after, that wasn't safely secured, and they've taken their own lives, or they've taken the lives of others. And in this pandemic, I heard actually one of those stories in this state, of a family who had a member of their family who during the time of self-isolation found a weapon, found a gun, and took their own life. And for me, it's very clear that we need to act quickly. And so your commitment, every single mother, every single family member's commitment to fight tirelessly to make that happen is something I really appreciate. And Anamaria, I want to talk about something that you are also very good at talking about, that I've really grown to admire you for, is talking about the intersection of the death of individuals who are shot by law enforcement, and the role that gun violence plays in that effort. And I think that it's important that we honor the victims of gun violence at the hands of law enforcement. Breonna Taylor, who we marked the 1-year anniversary last week of her passing, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Philando Castile, Trayvon Martin, and so many more individuals who should be with us today. And, can you talk about what that looks like? How, I know that you have played a role in advocating for the end of qualified immunity, something that I think we need to abolish at the federal level. Can you talk about that intersection and what that looks like?
So Moms Demand Action believes that gun violence is gun violence, even if it comes from a police officer. I was so grateful that Moms Demand Action took a stand against police violence. I am a mother of a young Black boy, and I didn't buy him a black hoodie until Keller came out with the One Albuquerque hoodie, because of what's happened in this country. So Moms Demand Action was really on board, and we were so involved and so busy with working to get House Bill 4 passed this year, and it did, and it's going to be amazing for the state of New Mexico. Having that defense of qualified immunity is really, really quite awful. Mapping police violence shows that 164 people have been shot and killed by police between 2013 and 2020 here in New Mexico. And nationally, 98% of the killings by police between those years have not resulted in a police officer being charged. So folks live their lives without justice, and it's quite terrifying for a lot of our communities.
It really is. And the fact that we have those types of, laws on our books that protect bad actors, that, do not allow for justice to be provided to our community and to our families is truly horrendous. And I just appreciate your advocacy at the state level. I think that is something that we need to make sure that we need to be able to lift up New Mexico model of leadership and to get that done and make sure that we are very clear about our commitment. In the first special session, we passed legislation to require body cameras for members of law enforcement when they're interacting with the public. I think that's another thing at the federal level that we begun, that we can continue, and that we can continue to strengthen. Making sure that simple things that make sense. Breonna Taylor would be alive if police were required to identify themselves before they came into their homes. Making sure that law enforcement, the collection of misconduct data, that's to be something that is accessible, so that we know the very real problems that we are trying to solve, and things that we've been told are not important. They need to wait. They need to be put on the back burner. I think when it comes to gun violence, when it comes to issues of systemic racism that exists within the systems of power, including law enforcement, that's something that we can't accept. And your advocacy, the advocacy of Moms Demand Action, is something that I really admire and respect. The other thing that I wanted to touch on today, one of the things is the violence intervention program. And I was really disappointed that at the state level we didn't see more investment that went into the programs that we have right here in Albuquerque, that make sure that we are looking at preventing gun violence at its very root in the systemic ways that it exists, and making sure that with a public health model, we are addressing hunger insecurity, housing insecurity, identifying the people that are most likely to be the victims or the perpetrators of gun violence in our communities. And so, I think that's something that I want to make sure that I'm advocating for in federal appropriations, that communities like Albuquerque, where in states where our budget is limited, and we reminded constantly that our budget is limited, that we're pushing to get as many federal grants, block grants, resources directly back into these programs. Have you had an opportunity to work with any of these individuals in the violence intervention program or programs similar to that?
We are building a relationship with them. As you probably know, the city of Albuquerque only has 2 individuals, and one is a police officer for the violence intervention program here in Albuquerque. And they've had successes, and we would hope that it grows and that it becomes its own entity outside of the city, and can really foster those relationships with the community members. Angel Garcia is the individual that leads the way with the program, and he's able to be that peer to the community and to make the change that way. And I know I always ask the city, are you going to hire more angels?
We need more angels, right? And I think that is what actually works. People that the community can identify with. Because, interactions with law enforcement, unfortunately, that is not always a positive interaction. I've seen that in my own life. I talk about my experience being pulled over for an expired registration and being asked to step out of my vehicle, having my vehicle searched and dismantled as I sat there scared, not really understanding as a young 16-year-old what was going on and why that was happening. And that story is not uncommon, right? Especially amongst communities of color, individuals who, don't, that is not the most comfortable interaction. And so you need people like Angel that the community can identify with, that they instantly have that sense of trust and they can explain what is the situation. What are the barriers and the obstacles that we need to overcome? Are there family members that need to be connected with services that the city or that the state or that our federal delegation can get them in touch with? And how can we make that a reality? And so I appreciate you putting it in those terms. We need more angels, and for you reminding the city that we really do, because that is how these programs operate and how they work and why they've been proven to work, because they build trust from within the community. And so I really appreciate that sense and that vision of doing it. And, you mentioned earlier today, Anamaria, that, semi-automatic weapons, the weapons of war, they don't have place in our country. And it's, it's very, there are folks that are scared to say that, but I think that from my perspective, putting a ban on semi-automatic weapons, semi-automatic assault rifles, making sure that the weapons of war are not in our streets where they have no place is something that is extremely important to me. Is that something that you think, I'm committed to getting it done at the federal level? What do you think the impact of that will be just from in our communities if we're able to get that across the finish line?
I think there's going to be a massive impact. I'm really happy you brought this up. My brother was a security forces officer in the Air Force, and he went to Iraq in 2007 and had a few tours. And he had the same gun that I've seen on individuals in Civic Plaza. Yeah. At the Oñate protest. There's a fence around the roundhouse right now because of those threats. And it's really shocking that is the mindset of a group of individuals that's necessary. There would be a massive impact for sure. And I think there was an article recently about how much that security is costing the state. So there's an example there too.
Yeah. And, and it's interesting too, when we talk about law enforcement, we talk about demilitarizing our police, and we need to talk about the transfer of those warlike weapons, and what that looks like, and being very clear that across all sectors, that chilling effect that these assault rifles have, that these semi-automatic weapons have to our community members. During the election, we heard stories about individuals who are walking around with these weapons that in order to prevent people from accessing the ballot box and to be too scared from getting to their polling locations. And, I was at the state capitol, and at times people would, proudly display assault rifles, right? Knowing that they could legally do so. But in an effect to create a chilling effect and try to provoke fear, very real fear in our communities. And so I appreciate that perspective as well. What do you think the biggest challenges? We hear of these horrendous killings, these every single day. I hear the real signs of gun violence in communities. We know that it exists. What do you think are the biggest challenges to getting gun violence legislation done, whether it be at the local or federal level?
I think the education piece it's what's hard. Letting folks know who oppose these measures that these statistics, these numbers we've been throwing out since we got on this are research based, our database, and they're not fictitious, that there is statistical concerns and there's ways to prevent these measures. And there is such a clash right now that I don't think I've seen since I've been alive between different viewpoints. There is such a dramatic difference in everyone, and meeting at the table seems like it would be so far away from us right now.
Well, thank you for fighting, Anamaria. I just want to say from me, I'm probably the only candidate in this race that dealt with active shooter drills, in the school systems as I was growing up. I've said this before, but I remember where I was when my family had to explain to me what the shooting at Columbine meant. I remember, you have these points, these inflection points in your life where you see what Sandy Hook meant. You understand that these instances of terror, these instances of fear, these instances of heartache in our communities, that they can be prevented. And I think the gun violence epidemic is one of the most pressing challenges facing our country, our state, our city, where we see gun violence, more than most other places in this country. And we need to do something about it. And so for Moms Demand Action, for standing up to make sure that this issue is put front and center, whether it be at the halls of the Roundhouse and the halls of Congress, I just want to thank you for that. And for making that difference in a very real way. No hate crime should happen in this country. No one should lose their lives because of the hate of individuals. And my family and friends in El Paso, when I thought about them in that moment of time, thinking about making sure that they were okay, the way my heart sank every single time someone didn't pick up the phone, that's a feeling I'll never forget. And people will never forget what it feels like to lose somebody that they knew, that a friend of theirs knew. We see these tributes that we put on Facebook all the time, or on Instagram or social media. And that pain, that sorrow is something that we can prevent. And we talked about some of the ways of doing that. I want to reaffirm my commitment to making that happen in Congress. Thank you so much, Anamaria. Is there anything else that you want to add before we conclude?
Well, you brought up Columbine, and I know I was in 5th grade at John Baker when Columbine happened. And actually how I got started with moms is because I saw a Facebook post almost 2 years ago that said there was an active shooter at my son's school. And we were the lucky ones that it was just a barricaded subject on the same street. But I knew I had to get involved and make sure that I was doing everything I could to ensure that post of an active shooter wasn't ever a reality for me and for my community.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that too. This is an epidemic that we can do something about. That we know that there is a strategy in place. We can address it at its root cause. We can make sure that we are preventing these tragedies in Columbine, these stories from happening. No family, no individual, no child should grow up in a society where we're being desensitized to gun violence because we are seeing it every single day. I put out a plan to address gun violence in our communities, to make sure that we are addressing it. A plan of a series of comprehensive legislation that addresses some of these issues we talk about. I invite anybody who's listening to visit victorreyes.org to take a look at that. Let me know what you think. And again, Anamaria, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate everything that you do, and thank you for being part of this struggle. I'm very honored that you joined us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
I'll talk to you soon. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We'll talk soon.